Welcome to the Integral Stage, Greg. Very nice to see you. And thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me and to read my Sophia Speaks paper.
Really good, glad to be here. I had worked my way through about a quarter of it. Then somehow I lost it. Then you sent it to me. I wrote it this morning. And I was like, oh my God, this is gold. So I really look forward to talking with you about it.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, what I'm thinking for our talk this morning, because I was listening to your dialogue with John on Untangling the Worldknot, which I recommend everybody watching this to listen to. It's just a fabulous discussion. And as you were proceeding in the conversation, especially some elements, around the different kinds of qualia, I was having this bing, bing, bing going off.
I can see that now.
Resonance with the stuff I've been investigating for, a little while, and that where my heart is. So what I was thinking is I'll give a little bit of time to introduce my approach, the integral grammatology, and then give you a space to talk a little bit about the relevant material from the Untangling the Worldknot, and then we can just explore the intersections together.
Perfect. Sounds great.
Great. Okay. Well, I think what launched my integral grammatology project was exploring the integral meta theory, but especially bringing it into dialogue with other approaches and other meta theories, and noticing that there were some implicit metaphysical commitments that actually did not get surfaced by the lenses that integral theory itself was using.
Right. And
Benita Roy had noticed this in the context of emphasis kind of on structural framing. And she preferred a process framing. So she outlined those differences and noted, that there's more of a object-oriented approach versus her verbal approach. And so that was in my mind somewhere. And I got into exploring object-oriented ontology and speculative realism, and noticed there was a lot of debate and division within that overall project of whether they're focusing again on objects or focusing more on process, like Whitehead. Or Whitehead actually kind of balances that a little bit, but there was either a processual emphasis or an object emphasis as the kind of underlying metaphysical architecture.
Totally.
And so I was thinking about that and noticing how do you mediate, because they seem to be both speaking from a similar level of complexity and sophistication of insight, but having a different, metaphysical foundation.
Right.
And so I started thinking integral theory, it has several commitments. It has the structural, but it also has the pronounal emphasis with the I, the it, the we, and the its. And what if we really began to look at what are the implicit metaphysics, the underlying philosophemes that seem to be related to different parts of speech?
Right.
And
what a glorious insight it is.
I was long conscious of the integral critique of postmodernism, of reducing everything just to language games. And to just kind of epistemological frames, and the need to kind of go deeper towards an ontology. But integral did it in its own way, and it did it in a way that still kind of privileged certain frames over others.
Clearly.
So I wanted to look at language in a way that actually mines it for not only its epistemological capacity, but actually maybe its resonance with ontological deep structures that seem to show up again and again in the ways that we put the world together.
Right. And I noticed you put Roy Bhaskaar's epistemic analysis and critique of the epistemic fallacy in prominent position there. That was actually very influential for me too. I really loved his critical realist analysis of and I can speak more to why that's unbelievably important for me from my critique of psychology, my discipline. But I was curious when I saw that. I had a number of excitements reading your chapter there, Bruce. But that was one of them, and I'm curious as to when that came, or how does that play into your connection to object-oriented ontology, or what role does that play in your thinking of this epistemological versus ontological difference?
Yes. I think I got introduced to Bhaskar first through object-oriented ontology.
Okay.
Levi Bryant and a few others referenced him approvingly. And Bhaskar is a thick and heavy read. It's not easy to dive into some of his stuff because he's got such heavy terminology. But they excited me enough with their references to him that I began to dive into his corpus and really found it very powerful and relevant, because integral theory in its earlier phases always critiqued kind of the epistemological reductionism of postmodernism. And yet when integral theory took its turn towards post-metaphysics, it did it in a way that really privileged perspectives to such a degree that it seemed to undermine ontology again, right? And
100%.
Fall into what Bhaskar calls the epistemic fallacy. And so I explored some of that through some other papers, looking at how Bhaskar could be used to I think reframe integral in a way that provides it with a little bit more grounding in the real, less dancing just in idealistic perspective taking. So yeah, that was important for me, and I wanted to highlight that in the Sophia Speaks paper, because it would be easy to take Sophia Speaks' focus on grammar to just be more language game and epistemological framing without any kind of ontological basis.
Yep, exactly. And that's one of the well, that was another thing I really wanted to let people know, that you are, in my estimation, you are effectively grappling with, for me, the tree of knowledge identifies the big three categories of epistemology, ontology, and I yoke those together inside the knower. So I have an ontological set of claims and I have an epistemology. And if I'm a scientist, then that makes me have a set of, this is what I claim reality to be ontologically, and this is my epistemological scientific justification. And then that then corresponds to the ontic reality. And so for me, I'm always, because I am a realist at the critical, speculative, healthy forms rather than naive forms. Okay, I'm always looking for, well, does the person actually have the proper relation, at least as far as where I'm coming from, between the ontic reality, ontology, and epistemology? And I found that you were just nailing that. So I just really wanted to, as another point of excitement that I had.
Wonderful. Yeah, thanks for that feedback on that. And yeah, so just to give a very brief overview, some people watching will have, been familiar with what I'm doing, but maybe some others aren't. So I wanted to look at how different parts of speech have been taken up as philosophemes and have informed different fundamental metaphysical systems throughout history. And so I looked at nounal, which focuses on object and structure. I looked at verbal, which focuses on process. I looked at pronounal, which is especially what Wilbur is doing with the perspectival framing. And then I looked at adjectival, where you find there's mostly a focus on the flux, the chaotic flux of qualia, pretty much, as you find in Hume, but also as you find in certain forms of Buddhism, for instance, Chittamatra and other approaches. Then I wanted to look at adverbial, where it focuses more on modes of becoming. The verbal is becoming, and the adverbial focuses on the different modes that becoming takes shape in. And you can see that in Heidegger's Ereignis, or in Whitehead's appeal to eternal objects as modes for becoming. In Spinoza, where there's every entity is kind of like a mode of being. And so I wanted to look at explore those, and then I think that was 5 of them, and then the 6th was the prepositional, which I noticed with especially Latour and Soriot and Michel Serres and Jean-Luc Nancy, Peter Sloterdijk. a number of people really exploring a relational ontology, one that really looks at the deep relational framing of things. But one of the things that especially Latour and Michel Serres emphasize is the role of prepositions, not only just to trace relations between existing objects, but actually to kind of establish a kind of vector space, a relational field in which everything that unfolds happens.
Nice.
And yeah, so I went through all of those, and I'll share maybe some images. I made up some little symbols for each of those. And my idea for this project was that we needed a kind of meta system, a meta framing that allows us to see the implicit metaphysics that underlie different both worldviews, but also meta theories. And as I talked about in the paper, I found that there were different meta theories, not only philosophies or worldviews, but also meta theories that took one or more of these elements as a root. One term I introduced is called Onto-choreography, which is a practice of just circulating the different elements to see how the worldview will shift if you privilege one or the other. And my sense of it in exploring this is that no system uses only one, but they usually will privilege one and then arrange the others in some kind of subordinate relationship to it.
Totally. And then your other term.
Henontology. And it might, I'm not sure I'm going to stick with that word, but because it could be confusing. Heno meaning one, but the way I meant it is, especially when you're looking in the field of theology and they're talking about what is the difference between an Indian or Hindu approach to theology versus Judeo-Christian, where you know there's clear monotheism in Judeo-Christian. There's the one God. In Hindu tradition, it's a henotheism, which is that there are multiple one gods, and it can be circulating, and that Krishna can be everybody, Shiva can be everybody, and so that's the same kind of spirit that I'm looking at with the use of these philosophemes, is that verbal can absorb everything, or the prepositional can absorb everything.
You may have seen, I have a thing called the I-quad coin. It's happened to have one right here. One of this little thing. Actually, put it that way. Whereby I'm playing around with one. If one of these things is one, and then I, imaginary number to the fourth, is also one. So I squared, and that's a square root of -1. You square that, you get -1. You square that, you get 1. And what that does is it plays around with the concept of one and differentiation in exactly that way. So one of the embedded in that is there's one, and then you actually, what is the dialectic between the one and all of its differentiation potentiality? That's what I'm playing with there, some of the symbolism. So that's what I'm attracted to in relationship to that, at least conception of henontology.
Wonderful. Yeah, I read you in several places on the iPod coin, but I didn't make that connection. So that's really cool.
Right. A lot of it is layered. I mean, don't worry, I don't blame anybody. A lot of it's in my head back here. But anyway, and then I jump out when they have opportunity. So I love so there are a couple of things that I really thought this was exciting. So audience out there, as far as I'm concerned, Bruce is on something unbelievably important here. So let me tell you some of the things that I saw as exciting, and we can go into this. But the grammatology, the idea that the grammar forms particular kinds of lenses, and then you have in there also, and they allow the transactive lenses between them. That's what you're just getting at, in a choreographic sort of way and a positional sort of way. And the image on it, make sure they have and I wasn't sure where this came from, but the Sophia image, circulating, obviously is loving wisdom, and the processes by which we can pray to the God, right? And our grammars for that in dynamic tension, and showing the complementary between the grammars and the facility that you gave us, and even a language of the grammars with the symbols. I was just like, man, I mean, this is really, really beautiful stuff. So
thank you very much. Yeah, I was deep into this project, some years ago, and then how publication goes. It took like 5 years for it to finally come out. So some of my thinking.
That's why I went to blogs, man. I was like, oh, screw academic. Those things are insane. Just get it out there. No,
exactly.
Obviously, to be refined, though. Obviously, I do a lot of. I learned how to publish online and all that because of the refinement that is required. But you certainly achieved that.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit about maybe some layers of integral grammatology and how it can be, approached and deployed.
Yes.
And then relate it to what got me so excited in your explorations.
Okay, great.
With Vervaeke.
Love it.
So the first thing I explained already really is that it could be used as a kind of meta frame for looking at the different philosophies that inform metaphysical systems. Right. And I tried to do a survey of some representative ones, definitely not exhaustive. And after I did that, I kept discovering more. So, that'll be unpacked more later. Okay. But there are other ways that you can look at it. One is that it can be related to, I think, models of development. Okay. And there are, we can track, in cognitive neurolinguistics and other fields, they kind of track the emergence of language, within us and what elements that we use and how we begin to construct meaning over time. But you can actually, I think, correlate different focuses of the philosophies to stages of development. And so I'll go into that a little bit more, but there's a way to look at each one of the philosophies. Actually, I argue in the paper, shows its own line of development, that it's held in a simpler way, and it can be, like the objects in object-oriented ontology are very different from, kind of primitive conceptions of objects. And so they can show their own lines of development, but they can also be correlated to different stages of development. And a little bit later, I'll talk about it, like Otto Lasky's model or David Michael Kleinberg-Levin's model. Both of them have some really beautiful correspondences. Okay. And Lasky's approach is founded on Bhaskar. So there's a nice connection there.
Right. Okay.
And then they also can be used psychodynamically. I've done some workshops with therapists on especially taking prepositional and adverbial lenses and playing with those things to look at interrelational dynamics, explore shadow, things like that. So
fascinating.
I'll talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah, you're familiar at all with ACT as an approach to psychotherapy? Yes. Okay. All right. From third wave cognitive behavioral, also a lot of concern in ACT, which I absorb in the unified approach, is the process by which language reifies thought. Okay. And meaning makes real is once we represent it and represent the relations in it, because Steve Hayes built ACT off of relational frame theory, and that's more technical, but whatever. Once you specify, then you sort of essentially reify relation, okay? And ACT of then in your thoughts, then from a Buddhist perspective, then become parasite of mind, and then they trap you, right? But then the whole what ACT is about, or a significant part on the opening up space is cognitive flexibility, the ways in which you then let go of the frames of language that are trapping your systems of thought. And so when you said that, I was like, oh yeah, you totally do propositional bouncing around, right? Which will create different angles of relation.
Exactly. Yeah. That's a really good connection there. And for people who don't know, ACT is acceptance and commitment therapy.
Right. Sorry.
Yeah. In the work that you were doing with John in the Untangling the Worldknot. Actually, I want to just, so I don't forget it, I just want to bookmark it here. One of the things that I explore in a later paper on prepositions is the mathematical symbol of the wild knot. Do you know about wild knots? Or in knot theory, a wild knot is a knot that doesn't have any terminal point. It's one that it's like the Celtic knots or the Tibetan ones that just keep on folding and kind of infinitely down. And so for me, the wild knot invokes us as beings that actually have roots all the way down to the singularity of being. And there's this, infolding of multiple relations that just keep receding into deeper recesses.
Beautiful.
So yeah, I connect the wild knot to your exploration of the world knot.
Perfect. Absolutely. Of course. Yes.
But what stood out for me in your talk with John, I think it's originally his notions of the adverbial and adjectival qualia.
Most definitely.
And you brought in this notion of the valence qualia, right? Or that emerged in between you in that dialogue, right?
Exactly. That was right. So just for the audience, I'll give a real quick synopsis of this. So I'm sure you guys know John Vervaeke is a cognitive scientist, right? And he's what I would call, he identifies as really trying to cultivate a meta-theoretical integrative view of cognitive science that harmonizes the various domains that define that field. Okay. And I like to emphasize this because John is climbing up a particular mountain of understanding from science and philosophy in a particular way. And I see myself as climbing up a very similar mountain, although we have completely different paths. I mean, I didn't know him until whatever, but and we really don't have the same field, although he takes an enormous amount of psychology, and I know a fair amount about philosophy and cognitive science, but I'm a clinical psychologist, okay? And so, but I'm interested in then what I call the problem of psychology, which would be very akin to his analysis of the chaos of cognitive science. And then we both are deeply concerned, I think like many of us right now, of the state of world knowledge and our capacity to cultivate wisdom out of the knowledge that we have relative to our power and the way we're using energy in just a basic earth sense, right? As Roy Bhaskar and Ken Wilber would clearly agree, we're not doing that in a way that's ideal in relationship to harmony, all right, and sustainability and all the other good classic words. So yeah, John and I climbed up different paths. And if you watch the whole series, the bottom line that I wanted to get to is John has a particular frame, what he calls recursive relevance realization, okay, which is a theory of cognition, basically. It's the foundational nature and function. When we say the nervous system is a neuroinformation processing system or the neurocognitive model of mind-brain, what do we mean by the cognitive? Okay? And John has a model of cognition and knowing, the 4P model, and a nature and function analysis called recursive relevance realization that goes down scale in a fractal sort of way and holds what would be the nature function interrelation. So I'll just say that for people out there. And so he now is a way to grab human cognitive science writ large, but he operates at the human level. And I need that because animals are different. And then my unified theory, which had 4 different pieces, okay, one of which was the tree of knowledge system, is this metaphysical map of ontic reality and our scientific ontological and epistemological mapping of that. And then the joint points, the behavioral investment theory, which provides a framework for what is the driving system that gives rise to the organization of the nervous system, okay, the coordination of behavioral investment. And then the influence matrix, which is how do we navigate our social coordination as social primates and other social animals, but particularly us as social primates. And then how do we organize our propositional knowing and justification? Okay. But I did not have a particular model of what's the fundamental nature function of cognition per se, So I hear John, I listened to him in the Worldknot, okay? Not Worldknot, I'm sorry. I listened to him in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, right? And then listened to his relevance realization. And this is what, 1.5 years ago or whatever. And I'm like, and then I hear his analysis and I'm like, oh my, I think that fits right directly into my system. It's like I'm walking around here listening to the podcast, all excited. And then I try to, John's really busy and I'm out here. Nobody knows what the hell I'm doing. I'm trying to knock on his door, John, and then over, is this guy crazy? He's got a crazy cartoon behind him, and then eventually we get to know each other. And no, I'm not crazy. And then we started on that journey. And then he then had me listen to a series of essays that he had done on it for his class over the summer. Okay, and so I just took his class, as it were, and then gave him feedback about my excitement that as I really understood his position on consciousness, intelligence, and cognition. And one of the things that he then does in the class, I can't remember, I think he talks about it I'm not sure if it really digested, and this gets right back to you. Sorry, I'm talking so much here for a second, but just give him the background. But he makes the distinction between adjectival qualia, what I had in my head is normal qualia, okay? And then he breaks out with the grammar of adverbial qualia, okay? And then he uses that to pull, and what it did for me was when he did it, it pulled the phenomenological observer-observed relation in a new angle. So adverbial qualia is the observer function, the mode of perceiving, and adjectival qualia is the screen that has the properties upon which you see, okay? The qualities, the adjective qualities. And when I heard him frame that, that was one of the most exciting moments I had when I was listening to his course, and I was like, I can't wait till we get there. However, what happens in relation is, and then I'll hush up, is like, I couldn't tell how the evolution of consciousness exactly gets, based on my own model. I had always had the intuition that what happens first, based on my behavioral investment model, is essentially a coordinating approach avoidance broadcast function, okay? And that gets embodied is some sort of, and I thought the base of qualia was pleasure and pain, and I still do at some level, but his talking was definitely higher up about the nature of consciousness. It was a whole nother level up. And I wasn't sure how our systems would connect, okay? Because when he used the term qualia, sometimes I was thinking, is he talking pleasure, pain? And then it was like, no, these are higher order perceptions. And what is the relationship between pleasure and pain? And then we started syncing up. I started explaining. I said, John, at least from behavioral perspective, investment theory, but prior to the observer-observed crystal clear function of interior subjective conscious experience, you have this embodied valence movement according to, and he's like, of course, yes, that would ground all of that. And we had this moment in the process, and we were like, let's call it evaluative qualia. And then 2 days later, I texted him, it's like valence qualia, and we both synced on that, came back in the next week, and then really was able to, and John got really excited about this because the base of his relevance realization is caring, okay? And since he's a cognitive scientist, he hadn't really pulled emotion and motivation quite as strongly. I'm a clinical psychologist that people split their rationality. I got to check your underlying motivations and emotions, your drives, the psychodynamic stuff. And so that didn't just bink, it connected, and it was very, very exciting. So that's a lot of background. I was trying to give our listeners, watchers here a little bit of background of that, but I'll hush up there and see what you want to pick up on in relation.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I'm really glad for that framing. And yeah, for people listening, if they haven't checked it out yet, my understanding of why he calls it adverbial qualia is that there's a here nowness and togetherness, and both of those here now and together are adverbial, modes or frames.
Totally. Right? And one of the things he emphasized, he's a meditator. Okay. And so what caught me, and I'm not, I should be, there's I'll shoot myself. But anyway, he talked about pure consciousness event in meditation, okay? And then whereby adjectival dissipates, but you have the presence of the observer basically feeding back on itself and becoming one with observation. And that pure consciousness event then, helped him articulate what he meant by consciousness. It also caught my ear because I usually associated consciousness with the adjectival. So yes, it is that mode of here-ness, nowness, togetherness. Those are the three words he uses. We even talked about the pure consciousness event as when you aspectualize the here-ness, nowness of, that's where you drop into that feedback loop capacity, and then boom, you get a just empty serenity of being.
In integral theory, they make a distinction between, Wilbur is drawing from yogic traditions, especially gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual states or forms of awareness. And the qualia, adjectival qualia, really corresponds to the subtle domain in that kind of framing. And in exploring this and talking it over with Layman Pascal and other friends, we positioned adverbial at the causal level, which in yogic tradition, causal is associated with basically just the open, pure witnessing consciousness that is prior to observable forms. So that tracks very well to how John is also relating adverbial qualia to that
Brilliant.
quality-less or pre-quality in terms of the adjectival normal qualia. It's the subtler, because in Tibetan tradition, it's the subtle, but then it's the super subtle. They don't say causal, but they say super subtle. It's just a deeper layer back. Right.
Yes.
So that adverbial correlates, I think, nicely to the causal. One thing that I was thinking about, and this is one thing I wanted to explore with you and check out with you in this conversation, is where the prepositional fits in relationship to that. All of them do. And there was one wonderful point in your talk where you started referencing, nouns and verbs and things after you were exploring the adjective and adverbial. My sense is, as you've seen from the paper, I was looking at prepositions in their role of being a prepositioning element, fundamental kind of vector setting element. Totally. There's a later phase of prepositions where we just use it to correlate perceived objects. But there's that deeper function, that's the vector setting. And so I relate that. And in fact, your notion of valence qualia actually helps maybe further embody and ground what's going on with the prepositional, in that you're talking about the approach avoidance. That's a from to dynamic. There's the basic from to with against kind of dynamic that's there that really even helps the subject emerge. Right?
Totally. Amen. Yeah, I mean, I now, as I've been absorbing the prepositional, it seems, and you'll probably like to hear this, it seems to go both ways very deep. Okay. In a very pleasing way for me. So I that's one of the reasons I'm very excited about this. I was like, ooh, I can go down, okay, meaning the embodiment of quality. I can feel my body moving to, from to, okay, and you can also go up and out with that in relation, and so for me, that grammatology has a very, I'm really learning to play with it, since you introduced it to me. I didn't have access to it. But as I have access to it, it's carving out areas on both sides of the structure. Okay. So, whenever something pulls me down deep and pulls me up meta, I generally find an approach valence toward it.
One thing that I wanted to bring in is this sense, and I'd like to check it out with you, as a a clinical psychologist, and I'm also trained in psychology, but not to the same depth and degree as you. My sense in exploring the grammatology is that we find developmentally, in terms of philosophies, for instance, there's been much more of a focus historically on substance and process, nouns and verbs, which are
totally
more kind of basic level grounding things that are relatable. And it's only really recently, or at high levels of culture historically, that you've ever found an emphasis on the adverbial or the prepositional. They're much more rare expressions of a metaphysics, and they tend to be more refined and sophisticated. And my sense is that the deeper something is, kind of the longer it takes to tease it out as an element in a world space.
Brilliant.
Right. So that the reason.
Totally. So yeah, let me so now I'm finally getting to your prepositional there. I'm finally growing, seeing the light, Bruce. Thank you. But let me hone in on this, because I think I can make some interesting linkages, ontological, human psychological linkages here. Okay. In my own story, in terms of what I was doing with my own theory and and the linkages of justification, okay, semantics, linguistic semantics, and perspectival knowing. All right. So when I started to play around, in 1996, into 1997, when I was building the justification idea, okay, what was happening was I was opening up the idea that language creates this information highway, okay, and that something serious happens when you do symbol alone. Okay, so this is broken symbol. There, antelope. Okay, now so you have a symbolic meaning, so I can now convey a thought to you, and then you can, but there are the antelope creates now a linkage of propositional meaning, right? That then opens up all sorts of different spaces, okay? And then I was like, okay, well, now I want to understand the left hemisphere processing systems, Vervaeke and Broca's area, and I want to digest Chomsky's notion of grammar. And then I want to connect that to more of the pictorial and right hemisphere, left hemisphere perspective, using John's language, perspectival gestalt. Okay. And what's the first thing I noticed is like, well, prospectively, what do is you pull out a figure relative to a ground. Okay. And so nouns, the first thing I was like, obviously, objects are labeled. Okay. And then for a long time, and of course, then the second thing, so notice the development, right? Then I was like, well, the second thing is they move and change over time. So now obviously I have nouns and verbs. And for years, I would walk around and say, well, that's the noun and verb. And then somebody pointed out, I was like, well, but of course, there's obviously then difference, okay, between nouns and verbs. And then for years, it was nouns, verbs, and adjectives, okay? And then it was like, well, but things change in proportional relation, various modes. It's like, oh, then, okay, adverbial, and I'm like, oh, I can now see that. And that's where actually I was. And I was using that. I didn't think about that in terms of, actually describing consciousness ever. That's just the last it was. But now, then John came along, that helped me got clear about this. And then really, since it's like, as I was listening to you talk about Layman Pascal, describing your theory, I'm like, the whole field is moving in relationship to itself. Right? It's coming out of the void and then defined in relational systems, and I'm in relationship to it. So I was like, oh my God, I've now filled in the propositional, which is both the framing of it all in many ways, and then the meta. So I was just sort of like, that's the deepest. I had to pull the object from the field, the figure from the ground, right? But then what was salient was the noun, not the background in noun relation, and voila. So anyway, all of my own understanding and the way in which I thought about justification, everything tracks that insight brilliantly.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I really like that narrative there. And I was mentioning that there's different ways to correlate this to development. So I want to briefly mention two connections I've made and just see how that relates to your understanding. I think maybe actually in some ways saying the same thing, but we'll see.
Okay, perfect.
So for Otto Lasky, he's drawing on Bhaskar, and he doesn't look at the full range of development. Mostly what he focuses on is working with leaders in organizations and helping them kind of track how meaning making is happening intersubjectively in groups and in communities and in organizations. And so the first level that he looks at is called the contextual. And contextual sounds relational, but really it's the primary subject-object field. It's really the subject up against a fixed wall of structure, institution, objects, the way things are. And it's just that kind of... Then there's, at some point, which relates to Bhaskar's emphasizing of absence, there's a notion or a recognition of a kind of gap. There's a gap in perception where you're able to kind of begin to step outside of that embedment. And you see there's a there's difference.
Mhm.
And
Okay.
that begins to open up then into more of a sense of process, that this field is not fixed. It is subject to development. There's
Okay.
whether there's a time gap or a space gap that allows you to see change, and you become more aware of how this dynamic has been developing, and you become more consciously participant in those processes of development and becoming and shifting.
Noun to verb.
Right, right. And then he says it moves on to the relational. And for him, the relational level then is actually beginning to see, I think prepositionally, where you begin to grab onto kind of the fundamental structuring, space-time structurings of the becoming, and the emotionally charged fields in which the different kind of shifts happen. So you become much more aware of, I think it's actually a further insight into how self is constructed in a field.
Okay.
But for him, then the next level is what he calls transforming. And transforming is, I think, the way I understand him, is when you really begin to grasp not just the relational or the verbal or the nounal, but actually them as a whole, self-constituting, dynamic or gestalt.
Okay.
And so that's his framing. And then I'll jump to one more.
Perfect.
Which David Michael Levin, he's got a wonderful series of books which meditate on the different human senses and deeply mine each of the senses for their ontological and epistemological depths and transformative capacities.
Wow.
And so he has one on the felt body sense. He has one on seeing. He's got one on listening. He's got one actually on the voice. And so the one on listening is the one I want to reference here.
Okay.
And he says basically the infant, he looks at stages of listening that unfold over time. And at first the infant is immersed in this kind of sonorous field of where the whole body is a listening organism. And it's not contracted into a center in the head or a point of identification. The whole body is listening organism and immersed in this sonorous ocean, just like pure shifting qualia, that without very clear sense of self-object differentiated yet. But in that sense, it's a holistic kind of participatory experience. But it's primitive in the sense that there's no structure there yet. Not much structure. There's elemental structure. As we become socialized, that's listening level one. As we become socialized, we begin to narrow our listening in, trimming out the different kinds of sounds that are not relevant to the, it's a relevance realization process where you begin to focus in on on the language that's used, on the meanings that are drawn within that culture, on the relationships that basically are afforded within that whole cultural context and linguistic context. And many people stay basically here. They just they come up with a conditioned cultural self, and they don't go much farther. He says if it goes to the next level of listening, then you begin to, again, it's that gap is introduced where you begin to see dynamics of reversibility within the auditory field, and you begin to see how self forms in relationship to the other, how self may be, or how some structures are privileged over others. And it becomes a critical listening where you begin to listen now not only to what is said, but to what underlies the meaning, what structures the meaning. And basically there's both a psychodynamic and a political dimension to this.
Sure.
And so it's where the critical self emerges, and you begin to listen not only to what is said, but to what is unsaid, to what is pre-said, all of those different kinds of things. And you begin a process of deconstruction and trying to work either, psychologically with helping people see how they're hearing and listening and relating to the world, and to reframe it, or politically to notice which voices are privileged or not privileged, and all of that.
I'm thinking about dialectical critical realism. Bhaskars jump into that, right?
Exactly, right. And then the next level for him is called hearkening. And that's level 4. And that's where you hearken back to the pre-ontological beginning of the sonorous field of the infant and pull it up and reclaim it, where you enter into a much more dynamic, holistic listening field that is beyond just the deconstructive, and connects it back down.
You see the light of the meta-reality.
Right. Exactly. And yeah, one of the things that he emphasizes here is that at that stage, you reclaim the always already that never yet was, by which he means that there was this open, participatory field that the infant was in, but when it's reclaimed at level 4, it's not what it was. From here, it looks like the beginning, but as it manifests here, it's a much more dynamically refined participatory field.
It's the pre-trans difference.
Exactly. Right. So I see in that also, the infant is immersed basically kind of in, you could say, the pain and pleasure domain, the valence domain, and the early qualitative domain. And so there's the adverbial, adjectival, and prepositional kind of play at the root there. When we then get conditioned, pretty much we get conditioned as subject and object in a very fixed context. Then the stage 3, the critical, is where the verbal comes in and begin to notice the process and shift and work relationally with the process. And then the hearkening basically opens back up to the deeper causally conditioning space of the adjective, of the adverbial and the prepositional, and that puts you into kind of a deep participatory play from a meta point of view.
And that's just great. I love that.
Yeah, so I guess I'm hoping
I can sit with that, or we can riff off of that. But I mean, just so I'm thinking also, model hierarchical complexity. You could layer this in a wide variety of different levels, but just first off, I love the idea of resonant through the various sensory systems, right? And just hearing that through the auditory system and just tracking and being with it, and really trying to feel myself back to my roots, the earliest phases of being in relation, and now the higher order phases of being in relation that was great, and prepositions are all around.
Great. Yeah. I that's something I've wanted to, develop in a paper, but I haven't yet. So it's one of those things that's probably just going to be on a video and a blog for a while.
Fair enough. I do something more with it. Well, we're finding in this new age that, hey, maybe that's just where it ought to be, for me speaking.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. So one of the other elements then maybe we could explore is, because I've noticed, in your conversations with John and in some of John's other conversations with other people talking about, well, your whole concern with wisdom energy and your talk with Steve McIntosh on wisdom energy and value energy and all of that. There's a couple things that, I could relate that to. One is adverbially and one is prepositionally.
Okay.
Adverbially, that's the adverbial approach focuses on modes of being.
Right.
And, John and you kind of explored in depth that primal here now and togetherness of the primal coherence field that establishes, the kind of the base of consciousness there. There's a way, in my view, the way I've been exploring the adverbial that maybe that can emerge also at higher registers. It doesn't quite go to the causal level like that in the same way, in the simple way, but in terms of values, I'm thinking here of Alistair McIntyre.
Okay.
I don't know if you're familiar with Alistair McIntyre. He has a
not ringing a bell.
He's an interesting character. His position at university is the professor of darkness and despair, and he was a Marxist and postmodern Marxist, and he wanted to kind of reveal the shortcomings of early religious theological thinking, and he decided to teach Aquinas to his students. And what happened is, in teaching Aquinas to his students, he found so much richness and depth there that he had no idea was there, that it totally reoriented his approach. And he began to look at virtues and values as a postmodern, in a postmodern way, in a postmodern framing. But one of his ideas is, he thinks of us as dependent rational animals.
Okay.
That
Get behind that.
we are, as independent beings, we're always rooted in our interdependent relations, and we can't get out of that. And pathology comes if we try to move too much towards independence without recognizing the interdependence.
I call that the counter-dependent state, where I don't need effing anyone. I've seen that in the clinic room, and I go, that's interesting.
Exactly. Yeah. So one of the things he talks about is that, we can look at the different virtues and the different values that emerge culturally. And he would say they're not, he would say ontologically, we can really differentiate states of flourishing for organic systems. They're either that you can say that, without just it being a relativistic frame, that there actually really are states of greater and lesser flourishing. And for him, values and virtues are those things that emerge from a living ecological context that actually help promote flourishing within that niche.
Beautiful.
And so it's not like existing out there in the ethers as this eternal thing, if you imagine it detached from manifest reality.
Right.
But if you imagine it as something that's emergent as an attractor within the overall field of reality.
Yes.
So for me, that's adverbial. Adverbial is
that actually goes way high then for me. Then that would be the attractor state. In fact, in some places I'll talk about the elephant sun god. Okay, elephant sun god is my metaphor, sort of reaching. I'm raised as an atheist in the West as a psychological scientist. The last thing I know about it, well, certainly, there are a lot of things I'll never know about, like Hinduism. So what is that? The exotic multi-god. So I talk about psychology when I open my chapter from racing horses to seeing the elephant drawing on this. There's an old Indian, John Godfrey Sachs makes this parallel from the Indians. You can see the elephant. The elephant sun god for me is my sort of embrace of our human conception of ultimate goodness. Okay, the energy of ultimate goodness, the ultimate attractor state. It would correspond directly to Aristotle's eudaimonic endpoint. Okay, the fundamental liminal space of the possible good that serves then as an organizing attractor state. And that, to me, that plays a very significant role in a metaphysical role, not a physical role, but a metaphysical role in the tree of knowledge conception of existence.
Beautiful. Yeah, I'd really been hoping and waiting for you to riff more on the elephant sun god, because I haven't heard a lot about that. So
yeah, and it connected to, so Alexander Baird, fascinating, wonderful, crazy philosopher, whom I'm very fond of, wrote a book called Syntheism. Syntheism, the God we create in the internet age. I may get that wrong, but and I was already an agnostic. I'm an agnostic atheist. That's how I define myself, which is I used to be sort of a Dawkins-esque atheist. And indeed, that's when I first encountered Wilbur, and my hyper science empiricist mind was overly critical of that. And I still struggle some with the spiritual ontology, but I'm much open and more flexible in relationship to that. But syntheism is believing in the concept of God for me. So theism, hey, there is a personal, we can know what God is about at some level, and we're going to make metaphysical claims through faith or logic or whatever. And then you say, well, actually, what is that? And that's always been a problem, at some specificity level. And then you get the new naturalist atheist view, which is that's absurd and that's all bad. I get raised on that, and I'm like, oh my God, but we cut the legs out from so much value and gave, as in Wilder's view, a materialist flatland. I mean, I had to experience, like, was it last year? Back when there were family gatherings, I had a family friend came back from college, and I'm like, oh, so what'd you learn in college? Actually, just a bunch of chemicals. I was like, oh my God, your parents just spent $25,000 for you to go to school, and you come back and you're like, what I learned is I'm a bag of chemicals. I'm like, oh no, it's like no wonder we're gonna die, right? I mean, that couldn't be more Wilberian. Like, oh no, modernity's gonna kill us, right? And so the idea of the concept of God, as an attractor state, and then for me, then it reaches me. Some people accuse me of cultural appropriation. That's not really what it's about. It's a symbol across a meta-modern view of finding wisdom through a wide variety of different integrated pluralistic traditions. And that's what it symbolizes.
Wonderful. Yeah. And yes, there are multiple ways I think you could approach it, but I've been thinking about it, with that, drawing on Whitehead or some of Heidegger, of that adverbial orientation, which is like a deep pre-structuring of a field along a mode of becoming. And so in that case, a post-metaphysical way of looking at, the good, the true, and the beautiful is as, attractors that are emergent, that are interdependent with, or they're inseparable from the field itself, and yet they serve a lodestar, function.
Liminal space organ or attractor state. Absolutely. Yes.
Exactly.
And I a little in the C back there, there's a little pink thing that's got a W in it, and it's got goodness, truth, and beauty, dignity, integrity, and well-being. And that's the ultimate energy, the metaphysical energy value lodestar. That's what it symbolizes. It connects the sort of mitochondria-like, which is energy producing, but that's physical, metabolic. But this is symbolic, transcendent energy. That's what it represents, is wisdom and the unification of goodness, truth, and beauty as liminal lodestars of attractors that would then raise the system, and then feed off. Oh, you see a good, true, beautiful thing there, and I want to incorporate that, and you get good, true, beautiful, negentropic complexification.
Wonderful. Yeah. Sloterdijk, I don't know if you've ever read his book, You Must Change Your Life. It's a really beautiful, profound series of meditations, really deep. But he talks about, he wants to look at human beings as fundamentally ascetic beings, meaning beings who become through practice. Okay. And that there's this, we're constantly remaking species, and that there's this always felt vertical tension. And that vertical tension of both seeing where we are, but always recognizing a more that's just beyond the horizon, that has kept, farmers improving their methods, athletes improving their skills, artists refine, spiritual becoming, all of that. He sweeps it up into this play of this internally felt vertical tension, which to me, that's that attractor space. That
actually, yeah, you add then the mode of being in adverbial states. Check this out then, okay? So now I'm going to bring in Zach Stein. All right. So Zach Stein and his big three of doing and skill development. Okay. So now I want to master skills and talents in a behavioral mode of doing. All right. So then from a John perspective, I'll activate my perspectival participatory narrative to gain some talent control around something. Okay. Then we can do being, all right, and ensoulment. And now I'm going to take my perspectival look at the dark night of the soul and my subjectivity, my pathic subjectivity, and be present with that and wrestle with all of my potential darkness and my heart in relationship to relational mattering in the world and my fears and wishes and all the psychodynamic depth stuff. So our adverbial will drop into the mode of, psychodynamic reflection, right? And then becoming transcendent, the transcendent mode of being to align oneself with the symbol of the good, the elephant sun god, right? And then become, better. Be, accept, do, and become better, and then you have a dharmic right relation kind of way. That's a really, powerful alignment right there.
That's great. Yeah. I was thinking in relationship to that, I've heard you emphasize that you yourself are looking for an integral pluralism, right? That it's not all just moving towards a single point, right? And in Wilber's model with the holons, at least one of the ideas behind that is there is no master holon towards which everything ultimately goes, but there's these emergent.
I would say the way you described it at the end, okay, if Sophia speaks, is exactly the way I would describe my goal of an integrated pluralism. Okay, that's exactly what I mean. In other words, there's the mountain of wisdom, okay, and then the multiplicity of different perspectives that can either grow, and translate and move across and synthesize, but never be static, or singular in terms of the one, there shall be only one Highlander kind of thing, not like that, but it is an interperspectival, the pluralistic perspectivalness, but at the same time of an integrated, core, and it's that dialectic. So that's another reason, by the way, I was, that's the one division, diversity and unity dialectic. That's exactly what I mean by integrated pluralism.
Great. Yeah. So discovering a lot of exciting resonance here.
That's right. That's right. That's why I was like, oh, and that I have not said it better than that. You guys definitely read that. And the image that you give around them and the spiritual image that you give, it's just of the Mount Sophia and the grammatology vision is just beautiful. Just exactly. That's my elephant sun guy. Okay.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Because it's loving wisdom through the various perspectives that is a whole, but unique on the frame and what you look through.
Right. Yeah. Some friends and I, we joke with, when you find the model that's becoming the one, we call that the asshole on.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And and we each bring we're our own one. I can be more or less singularity, although ask the different parts of me. Sometimes they disagree. Right. But then, that's right. That's the harmony. It's that unity and diversity, integrated pluralistic dialectic. That's the sensibility that's the meta-modern sensibility that if we spread will actually allow us to ground wisdom in local and cosmic places.
One of the prepositional thinkers that I don't think I mentioned in Sophia Speaks is theologian and philosopher called William Desmond. And he has an approach called metaxology. And it's a meta approach, but metaxo here relating to between rather than above or over. And so he looks at how there are different levels of there's like the erotic movement, which for him culminates in the dialectical move, where the opposites are correlated together. But beyond that, he situates it in what he calls an agapeic field, which is that any dialectical becoming immediately discovers itself in a field of excess, in which it has to have to discover its own relations, its own limitations, its own relations, and transcendences around it. So anyway, that's just basically another way.
That got me thinking of, I don't know if you've heard of Corey David Barker and his architectonic simulation, and he has an idea of basically creating a cognitive meta-taxonic map of knowledge systems of how we know. And so he and I have worked together some about what the tree of knowledge in that system in relation. So there was some linkage of association in another meta taxonomy, cognitive sphere, which is so Corey David Barker's work is interesting.
I've seen that in passing, so that's something I definitely want to check out more.
He's on our TOK list, by the way, and I can certainly, I'll send you a link and we can, I'm sure I'd be able to hook you up with it.
Great. Really like that. And I guess the one other thing I wanted to bring in then is I mentioned, because of, again, some of your and John's explorations of wisdom and taking this not only as a abstract meta framing, but actually something that can be deployed in a way that helps to generate wisdom, foster the dialogos that happened between you and John, and maybe is happening between us right now.
I feel it.
Yeah, I've been thinking, and I've done a little bit of work with it. I mentioned with some therapists, but there's different ways to use the. For instance, all of the parts of speech, you can feel into those phenomenologically. You can just practice seeing the world verbally or seeing the world nounally, and what shows up for you. Many years ago, I was inspired by David Bohm and his Rio Mode project, where he wanted to develop. So I created my own language, which had no nouns in it, and it was all processes and perspectives. And that was a psychoactive experiment, because I had to actually begin to see the world in a different way in order to come up with a grammar that could capture that.
Beautiful.
But in the present context of this integral grammatology, what I wanted to talk about is especially, prepositions and how they could be worked with. One is just feeling them. William James talked about, we always focus on the nouns and verbs, but the conjunctions and the prepositions, they all have their own felt sense, their own reality. And you can explore that. One way is I work with people in dyads or triads, and just like if I say, I with you, I over you, I against you, I within you, and you sit and you hold those different fields, you can feel self-object constellate differently in that kind of practice. So that's one, is to just practice circulating through those and explore the dynamics of those relations. Another one suggested by my friend and colleague, Michael Schwartz. He's an art historian and integral thinker. He talked about, and he's also a deep kind of tantric practitioner, but he talked about just resting in the causal, basically the open clearing, the adverbial in John's, in your language, the adverbial, resting in that, and then invoking the different prepositions to see, actually, again, just get in a very, very super subtle sense of how a field is shaped by those relations. And another would be like psychodynamically to just think about what's going on in a relationship, between two people. And then try to pull out what is the preposition that's in play there most. Is it this, away from dynamic, or against, or with, or to, or, all of these different things, and then practice replacing that preposition with a different one and what happens. So it's a kind of shadow work exercise in a sense.
Oh, man. Yep. I mean, my clinical mind's popping off all sorts of different possibilities. The beauty of in relationship to time, let me just hit a couple of. For me, the work that I do at a psychodynamic, there's psychodynamic and then psychoanalytic. Okay. I think psychoanalytic work can be brilliant. It's also a little different than standard psychotherapy psychodynamic. Okay. I often say Freud took two steps, one into the subconscious and then one into the unconscious. Okay. I work mostly at the subconscious and levels there. We live in a self relative to other relational field in our subconscious. It's called in the influence matrix, the fourth branch on the tree back there, maps self in relationship to other. Okay. And there's three process dimensions, all right, that operate. which are power, the I'm above you or you above me. Okay. Love, we're together. Okay. I am with you, in you, or against, I hate you or not. Okay. And freedom, which is I move away from you. Okay. Or, fused with you. And so each of these, the positional placement of self in relationship to other, that relational frame is framing all that. So now what we can do through what you're saying, and I just never thought about it this way. So you open up the logical justifying structure, right? To then see the translation of relation, And so you can now just enter into that space, get that self-conscious justifier, seeing the prepositional relation, and then you put it on the matrix field, and then you have a lens of awareness that you can shine, right? And then if I'm aware of that, and then now I want to do participatory intuitive things, because you want to do it from the bottom too. So with the prepositional framing, what you've just given me is a beautiful set of tools to identify, move toward, move away, move against, and situate our capacity to shift the person's frame, get adjacent to what their parasite of mind, both conscious and subconscious systems are. So, that's what a tool. That'd be absolutely great.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's exciting, and to me makes me want to dive in more deeply into that part of your work as well. Because I think
be happy. And I know, and for my day job is teaching people how to do therapy. So that's my day job. I'm a theorist at night and I'm a therapist during the day, and teaching all people how to be psychological doctors. And so, in the intrapsychic and interpersonal field, those are the two fields: how the narrator relates to the heart, and how we relate to other people in the present and other people in the past. And the maladaptive versus adaptive potentialities is basically the frame. And our task as therapists is to have flexible tools to relate and empathize with people and give them support for their position, and then position ourselves to maximize their growth and engender flexibility and hope and the capacity to envision adaptive, and then start to build those skills. So these kinds of tools are exactly the tools of the toolbox of a therapist. So that's really cool.
All right. Well, I know we have another interview scheduled in a few minutes, so I don't want to end our conversation. I'm enjoying it too much, but
right. Well, there is a real world out there that we do have to bounce into. But this is great. I really made my day reading your work, and it's activated all sorts of associations. And so I encourage folks to check it out. And I'm so glad that we're able to sync up this way and do our own little bit of dialogos here.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that, and hopefully maybe we can, as I let things echo around, maybe we can, take it a little further sometime.
I'd love to circle back. There's obviously a lot of fruitful, fruit-bearing possibilities in this. Lots of seeds planted, a lot of possible fruit. So I'm all there, man.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Birch. I appreciate it. Yep.
Take care.